A group of elderly, retired men gather each morning at a cafe in Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv is Israel's largest city. They drink their coffee and sit for hours discussing world politics, current affairs. Given the state of the world, their talks are usually fear-filled and patently depressing. One day, one of the men startles the others by announcing, "You know what? I'm not going to be afraid any longer. I'm not going to allow my fear of what might happen to me or the world weigh me down." The others they're shocked. But then one of them notices something peculiar. Wait a minute. If you're no longer going to be afraid about life and the world, why do you look so worried? To which the man responds, "You think it's easy to live without fear?" The topic as stated for my sermon this morning is what fear? And it's posed in a less than rhetorical manner. What fear? I'm not here to atomize fear. You've had weeks of discussion and focus in on the topic. Invariably, some of the things that I touch on are things that have been discussed, or equally likely, things that you grapple with any more than I do. What fear? Fear of the unknown. And that is a peculiar paradox because the fear of the unknown is alluring. It makes us feel alive, as opposed to its counter opposite, constancy, familiarity, which can be routine or boring. There is something sexy, alluring, the unknown. It's fear-ridden, but it draws us. Fear of natural disasters. We live in a world filled with natural law. Gravity doesn't care what it takes hold of. Fear of our planet becoming less livable. Fear of change. Personal change, change around us. Fear of loss of a job. Fear of loss of love. Am I no longer lovable? Am I no longer capable of loving? Fear of a stranger. She's not like us. They're not like us. Fear of rejection. I mean, I'm not perfect. I'm not as desirable as I think I might be. Fear of growing older, the inevitabilities. Fear of death, the ultimate enigma. What does that mean outside of the biology of a cessation of life? Fear of not having sufficient funds to live in retirement. It's a serious concern. Fear of physical or, equally likely, mental decline. Fear of not living fully. And perhaps that's the greatest fear, not living fully. You can tell this is a very upbeat, very light topic for this morning's discussion. Wait, it gets worse. We have so many things, need I say, I'm just pandering to say this, so many things of which we can be fearful of. I particularly gravitate towards a 20th century theologian, Milton Steinberg. Perhaps some of you have read or are familiar with some of his works. He died as a young man. He had a congenital heart defect, and he was exceptionally prolific in the brief period of his life. I think he died in his 40s. Anyway, in one of his books, a collection of his essays entitled A Believing Jew, his essay, The Fear of Life, interesting title, The Fear of Life. And this is what he writes: "Only human beings are afraid of life because only they can imagine the future." Isn't that extraordinary? What might happen? The possibilities are infinite. What might happen? And we can think in those terms. And not only can we think in those terms, Not uncommonly, we do think in those terms. And here's a serious question, of which, incidentally, the rabbinic enterprise engages. Would have it been better for the world to have been created or not to have been created, given the hardships of life, given the inherent fears of living? And you know what they conclude? Better not to have created the world. Had God not created the world, it would have been better off. But since the world is created, engage fully. Assuage your fear. Move forward in life, as it were. Do you honestly? And here I mean this in a less than rhetoric way. God created the universe. God created our lives so that we should live in fear. It's not a God that I would care to ascribe to. More than 80 times in the Hebrew Bible, God tells us not to fear. The Hebrew al tirah, don't fear. In the same way that God says, lo tirtzach, don't murder, don't steal, don't fear. Now, everything that we ascribe to God is a human projection. We live in the world of the subjective. But again, I ask, do you think God put us on this planet so that we should be fearful? God says it to Abraham, don't fear, to Isaac, to Jacob, to Moses, to Joshua, to the prophets, al tirah, don't fear. Knock it off. Go live. Stop it. Don't even go down that path. Why do you think God mentions it so many times in the Hebrew Bible, and it's also in the Christian Bible, need I say? God knows, as we know, as you know, as I know, our fears can just simply drain the joy out of life. And it does. It just saps life of its vitality, that fear that invariably all of us struggle with at different times, repeatedly throughout our existence. Fearful people are less generous. Fearful people are simply less happy. Fearful people are less forgiving. They're less real. They're less immediate. Why are they less immediate? Because they're overcome with fear. They're preoccupied by fear. They may be physically present, but their mind is somewhere else, filled, gripped by fear. In the Hebrew Bible, among the first words spoken by a human being, God mentions fear. And the quote that I just want to share with you this morning comes from the book of Genesis. And if you read the text not as a historic chronology, but a literary chronology, this is the first reference of fear in the Hebrew Bible. God said, I heard the sound of you in the garden. He meaning Adam. I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked and I hid myself. This was a legitimate fear. The setting is in the Garden of Eden, where human beings are specifically told, don't eat from the tree that is betoch hagan, that is in the center of the garden. And see this as metaphor. Don't see this as pseudoscience. Don't do that. And as for so many of us, when we're told not to do something, we're more inclined to want to try to do it. In any event, Adam says, I was afraid. The first reference, v'ira, and I was afraid. Question that I struggle with, and I suspect, again, I'm no different than anyone here. How can we overcome fear, and how can we live more fully in an admittedly scary world? For the sake of time and the brevity of my comments, I want to just offer two suggestions. Not to oversimplify, not to make simplistic, but just to hone in on two suggestions. The first one comes from the late, great Viktor Frankl. He died in 1997, and he was a Holocaust survivor. He was a neurologist and a psychiatrist. You might know him from his epic work, truly classic work, Man's Search for Meaning. His theory, one of which is logotherapy, that what is typically missing in most of our human dynamic in terms of any type of psychological encounter is to struggle with meaning in life. Meaning is in many ways more important than other drives that we have for food or sex or affirmation, to search for meaning, depth. Mind you, again, I repeat, he was a Holocaust survivor. He spent time in Auschwitz, of all places. And this is what he writes: "You cannot always control what happens to you, but you can always control how you respond to what happens to you." That's our choice. That's a God-given choice. How you respond to fear is ultimately a choice. It can bury you under, it can preoccupy you, it can paralyze you if you let it. Do you remember I once said, and I believe from this very lectern, suffering and decline is an inevitability, but misery is a choice. So much of life is a choice. Arguably one of the greatest gifts outside of life itself that God has bestowed within all of us, there are no children of a lesser God, is the power of free will. We can shake our fist to the heavens. We can embrace God. We can react largely in the manner in which our values guide us, give us direction. It's our choice. You can channel your fear. All of us have been given the God-given strength to do so. Second suggestion, we're not alone. I actually would hold that it is rational to posit God, to struggle with the notion of God. The Hebrew word Yisrael, Israel, means struggle with God. If you're indifferent to God, you don't take God seriously. If you hate God, you do take God seriously. If you love God, you do take God seriously. The opposite of love is not hatred, it's indifference. Indifference, you're off the board. Emotional affinity, intellectual affinity, you're in the game. We're not alone. I actually believe that. I know it's a faith statement, and I know you can't ultimately argue faith. It's personal, to each his or her own. There are 150 Psalms in the Hebrew Bible. The 23rd is probably the most popular. Though I walk through the valley of death, and the preposition is operative, walking through, not staying in, walking through the valley of death. Lo ira ra ki ata imadi. I fear no harm. Why? Ki ata imadi, because you're with me. We're not alone. Now, is this a human projection because of our own insecurity? Maybe it is. You have an alternative? Is everything in life reduced simply to our genetics? Are we nothing more than biological creatures? Is everything in life a coincidence? We're not a fluke of the universe. I have argued, I will continue to argue, the most important question a human being can possibly ask is whether God exists. I know, as you know, one of the greatest challenges to belief is human suffering. And I'm not even talking about the human suffering that we cause one to the other. Theodicy, God caused suffering. Do you honestly believe we're an oops of the universe? Over an infinite number of possibilities? Amino acids come together, opposable thumbs, conscious thoughts, human interaction. And by the way, I'm a big advocate of evolution. Life is not an illusion. You know the philosophical construct? If a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to see it or hear it, does it make a sound? You bet it makes a sound. We live in a physical world created by something greater than all of us, God. There's more to our existence than what we encounter here on earth. Ve'ata imadi, you're with me. We're not alone. Just two suggestions. How you respond to fear is a choice given human free will, and we're not alone. Let me conclude with this as a postscript. In the mid-18th century, there was a rabbi by the name of Nachman of Gotlieb. He was a mystic. He died as a young man. He didn't write much during the course of his life, but he gave discourses. He wrote letters. He was quoted often. And he once wrote that Kol ha'olam kulo gesher tsar me'od v'ha'ikar lo mifached klal. What does that translate as? Reb Nachman of Gotlieb says the whole world is a narrow bridge. V'ha'ikar, but the essence, the most important thing, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. God willing, I'm married to my bride 36 years in July. I know what you're thinking. I got married when I was 9 years old. All right, I know you're not thinking that. Heaven knows. Just look at me, for God's sakes. 36 years, God willing, in July. And the music that I selected to walk down to our wedding canopy was this quote: "The whole world is a narrow bridge, but the essence in life is not to be afraid." Don't be afraid. Don't do it. You have that choice. You have that power. You have that God-given power, in part because you're not alone, because life is not a fluke, because God didn't put us on this planet so that we should be fear-filled. On the contrary, because we know up here, not in here, up here, it takes us away. It drains life from us. It distracts us. We humans are called on every day to cross that narrow bridge. If we allow our fear to paralyze us, fearing we'll fall off that bridge, that narrow bridge. Ko ha'ulam kulo. The whole world is a gesher tsar me'od, is a narrow bridge. If we fear that we'll fall off the bridge, we'd never get anywhere in life. We'd never fully engage in the blessing that God gave us of our life. Don't let that happen. Don't allow it to happen the result of external factors which are inevitable. It's your choice. It's our choice. It always has been. Al tira, don't fear. Boker tov, as we say in Hebrew. Good morning, everyone. God bless each and every one of you. And together can we say, Amen.